If you plan to work wood with just hand tools, then you're going to need to learn how to 6 square a board. That means make it flat, smooth, and square on all 6 surfaces. Face, face, edge, edge, end, end. So let me go through some of the basic steps. First thing I want to point out is I often use a scrub plane, and some people say, why bother with a scrub plane? Come in here. I just took this board out of the rack, and as I was looking at it, you see what that is right there? That was a little rock, and that little rock was stuck in there. I hardly noticed it. I would much rather be hitting that little rock with my rough scrub plane than with my good smoother. So that's the reason why I prefer to go in and do the initial flattening with the scrub plane. Step number 1, you've got to prepare what we call your reference face. This is the surface that is going to be used to measure the squareness of the edge, the squareness of the end, the thickness of the board, everything. So this one has to be perfect. You can't do that until you get your board to sit nice and flat. If you were to try to see how this board's rocking, if you were to try to clamp that in place and start working on the surface, every time you come to this end, the board is going to flex under the weight of the plane and then spring back up. Very difficult to get that nice and flat under those circumstances. So your first step, and to work the concave side, it's always going to be easier. The board is going to, if you see the way the rings are running like this, as the board dries, it's going to want to flatten out. So this is going to be the concave side. In working the concave side, I usually just have to address the outside long edges to find the high spot to get it to sit flat. If I were to do the reverse and try to work the convex side, that rocks side to side like this, now you've got to remove all that middle stock before you can get that thing to sit flat. Way too much work. So I would go through, I'd use my scrub plane. What I like about the scrub plane, other than the fact that you can remove a lot of material quickly, you can also use it one-handed. So instead of having to bench dog this in every time, work it, flip it over, check it, undo it, do it again, I just work up against one bench dog. I hold the board with this hand, using this, the one hand, go in there and take off what I think are the high spots until I finally get that to sit perfectly still. And by that I mean when you push corner to corner like that, there is absolutely no movement. And there's quite a process of going in there and detecting and finding where those high spots are. We've covered that in other videos, but just know that step number 1, which is going to be critical to the entire process, is get the concave side to sit perfectly flat. Now, once that's done, I'm going to come in, and typically, if this is a piece of 4/4 lumber, which means it's going to be an inch, maybe a little bit better, the idea is that you should be able to finish off with 3/4 of an inch. And ideally, to get the most stable 3/4 inch piece, you want to take the same amount off both sides. If you were to take it all off of one side, you may find out that it's going to cup on you because you've disrupted the internal pressure, or not pressure, but stresses inside that board. And while there's no guarantee that that's going to lay perfectly flat, it's your best bet. So I've got my board to sit nice and flat. I'm going to dog it in place. Always good to use a mallet or a hammer or whatever. I got this little brass mallet I like. And just knock your dogs down so that that pulls that down and sits nice and flat. My first tool would be my scrub plane. And I would go through, I'd eyeball that and see where the high spots are. Come in and go to work on the high spots. And like an axe, you're going to try to get that close. I want to get rid of all this rough exterior that's hiding some of those little pebbles. Get it as close as possible. I'm not going to come right down to that line. I'm going to just get it close, and the more you do this, the closer you can get with this. What you really like about that is it moves a lot of material quickly. Now my next step, depending on the length of the board, in fact on something like that, I would probably choose to use my jointer. And the purpose of the jointer, because it has a long reference hole, it's going to ride the high spots and help you bring them all down to one level. The shorter the plane, the more it's going to do this and follow the bumps and valleys and not necessarily get it flat, but it will come out smooth. The jointer is your best bet. Now, people say, do you need to go with a smoother afterwards? I prefer to prepare my blade on my jointer the same as I do on my smoother. That means that ideally, once I'm done with the jointer, maybe I'm finished. I don't have to do anything more with it. So if I can perfect the surface from the jointer, one less step. After we've done this face, we'll mark it as such, and I prefer then to go to an edge. So I would typically, depending on how big the board is, I may either have it sitting here in the bench dogs like that, or I'd put it in the vise, and I would go in, and my first step and on a long edge like this, I would use my jointer. Actually, this is another area where I might come in and use my scrub plane, depending on the condition of that, and I would get that close, getting rid of that rough exterior. There's always going to be wind-blown dirt in a rough surface like that. Then I would take my jointer, and my first step would be to get this surface flat. That doesn't mean square, that doesn't mean, well, kind of means straight, but side to side I want it to be flat. At that point, I would get my square, and I usually hold this up to the light, but I very carefully go in, and if this surface, my reference surface, is perfectly flat end to end, then anywhere I check this, I'm always going to be reading from the same surface. So I don't have to go in there and check there in 4 or 5 places. I'll go in here, I'll use that, and I'll determine whether or not I have a high spot one side or the other. Now I got to stop right there because I forgot to mention. Critical step in preparing that initial surface is to use your winding sticks to determine when it's flat. And simply, in as simple terms as possible, what the winding sticks do is they exaggerate any wind or twist. So the back one, and by the way, they are straight and they have parallel edges, both of them. The white dot is used, let me show you. Setting that on my board, I want to have it centered so it's not tilted one way or the other. So the white dot is the center of the winding stick. It's easy to guess the center of the board. It's difficult to guess the center of the winding stick without some kind of a aid like that, and the middle of the board. This one gives me the center of the winding stick. I put it in the middle of the board. Simple as that. This one goes down on this end. As you sight along the top, you can tell by the little white tabs on either end whether or not the 2 edges are parallel, and that is how you use your winding sticks to determine when it's out of wind or twist, nice and flat. All right, so we go in here. Once we've got that flat, we're going to go in and we want to square it to the reference surface. Now, that is it's critical that I make sure that my blade is parallel to the sole. If it isn't, every pass I take is going to take more off of one side than the other. And I'd go in and check it until I eventually get it sitting nice and flat, or square, sorry, to the reference face. My next step, I use the edge of my plane like this, and I need to go in and make sure that that edge is straight. And the plane is always going to create a convex surface, so you have to learn how to go in and work with that. Literally hollow this out before you start taking full length passes, and at some point when the plane no longer pivots, you'll be able to tell that you've managed to get it nice and straight. Check it again to make sure you kept it square. My next move is to use something called a panel gauge, and a panel gauge allows you to go in kind of like a marking gauge, only it's a little bit bigger. And you would set that up. The head has more surface area, so I would go in there, I would set it for whatever dimension I want, lock it with the pin, and then the head, referencing off the straightened edge, gives you a parallel mark on the other side that I would then either saw and plane, or just plane, depending on how close I am, down to final width. And again, you want to keep that one square. Then your next step, which is going to be addressing surface number 4, would be to go in and just square the end, square so that it is square to the face and square to the edge. You can use a shooting board. You can also do it by hand, sitting in the bench upright like this. It's a little bit difficult because you're having to balance the plane in 2 directions, this way and this way. Always making sure that you chamfer the back side along the top so that when you plane, you don't break those last fibers off. And when you're getting down to the final surface, you want to just get to where that little chamfer begins. Don't go too far. Once you've done that, you're going to measure it to length, square your line, go in and either saw close to the line, or if you're almost at the edge, you can plane the rest of it. Final step is to take your marking gauge that you would set to the thickness. And if it's going to be 3/4 of an inch, I would set that at 3/4 of an inch. And then referencing off of my reference face, I would scribe a line all the way around both edges, the ends and back, and then laying that flat on the bench, depending on how much material I had to remove. I either start with a scrub plane or with a jointer, but then I go down to the point where I eventually get to that line all the way around, and I should have a board that is flat, uniform thickness, 3/4 of an inch all the way around, straight square edge, edges are parallel, and same thing with the ends. And that's how you go through, in a quick version, squaring a board on all 6 sides. Now, if you think about it, when you build a piece of furniture, or when they built a piece of furniture 150 years ago, and that's how the whole process was done, every piece had to be done like that. And especially when you think about drawers, if one piece was a little bit out, it's going to introduce twist to the drawer. So it's a process that really requires a high level of precision. But when I teach my classes, the first board might take them 4 or 5 hours to do. The second board's done in a couple of hours, and with every additional one, they get a little bit quicker. Don't see a huge change on the 5th to 6th as you might see from the 1st to the 2nd, but it does get easier, and you do get better at it. Good luck.